As we continue our series on commas, we get to a couple of new rules. So let's jump right in and see how these rules work and how they affect commas. In the first case here, we start our sentence with a subordinating conjunction. And what a subordinating conjunction does is it is always part of a clause, a dependent clause. So it's usually part of this dependent clause, and it ties this dependent clause to another part of the sentence, which normally is an independent clause. Okay, so that's a lot of clauses. So just to review quickly, a clause always has a subject and a verb, and it's either dependent or independent. So in other words, dependent clauses cannot be a sentence by themselves. Independent clauses can be perfectly fine by themselves as a sentence. And you can now see that this is the case. So our independent clause, our relationship is complicated, that can be a sentence. Our first clause, since he spends so much time on Facebook, that's not complete. And it's because of this conjunction that it's not complete. There are lots of other subordinating conjunctions that you can watch out for as well. So some examples would be if, because, although. And in each case, what they do is they change that clause to make it dependent. Now, the rule then for commas, you're probably wondering, when am I going to get to commas, is that if you start with a dependent clause that starts with a subordinating conjunction, and you link it then to a follow-up independent clause, then you can stick a comma in between. Okay, so the pattern is fairly straightforward then. It's subordinating conjunction, part of a dependent clause, and this whole unit comes before a comma and is followed up by an independent clause. That's our pattern. There's one little wrinkle to this. If you were to shift this around, so let's just reverse the order of these two, then you can get rid of the comma. So you don't need a comma in this case. And you can see that in the second example. So our relationship is complicated. We start with our independent clause, then we have our subordinating conjunction, and we finish the rest, and this becomes part of the dependent clause. Obviously, this is a pattern. It's not a hard and fast rule. There are going to be exceptions, but it's a really useful guide for trying to figure out where you need that comma and where that pause is necessary. And that brings us to our second rule, which is that you can also use a comma if you are introducing a quotation. Now, there are lots of ways to introduce quotations. So you can do it with a colon, or you can just run your introductory phrase right into the quotation. But one particular way in which we can introduce the quote is, as we said, with a comma. And what's usually the kind of pattern that we see here is that we have what's called a verb of expression. I'm not sure if that's the official name, but we can call it that in any case. And a verb of expression indicates that the author or the speaker is expressing an opinion. So these are verbs like said, or suggests, or argues, or insinuates, or opines, if you want something really old-fashioned. And then we have a subject that goes with it, such as she or Prenderwick, and that person is doing the expression. So as long as you have those two components in your opening phrase, the subject and then the verb of expression, you can add a few other things as well if you like, but as long as you have that at the core, then you can typically add that comma afterwards, and then we get the quotation. It's not the only way to do it, and that's why I've added the last example here as well, but it is probably the most common. So the last example here shows another way to introduce a quotation with a comma, and in this case what we've done is we've opened up with a prepositional phrase. In, that's the preposition. Bob Marley's words. Words is the object of the preposition. And then we get our comma, and then we get the quotation. And actually, when you take the quotation marks off, and this is kind of cool, so we get rid of this, the whole thing together is one complete sentence. We have a kind of introductory phrase, then we have our comma, and then we get to the main clause. Well, actually, this is still a dependent clause, and then we get to our independent clause. So that's our second rule. You can use a comma after an introductory phrase or a short clause in order to introduce a quotation.